Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. So, history does not move evenly across the map. There are moments in history where certain parts of the world become very important for geopolitics. This is one of those moments in history. So today, from shifting international trade routes to sanctioned regimes to war in Ukraine, South Caucasus and the greater Caspian region has become the center of the geopolitics and geoeconomics. And we are lucky today because we are joined by people who did not just observe this, they also analyzed, they also shaped it, and they analyzed and they advised on them at highest levels. So today we are joined by Mr. James Sharp, who used to be the ambassador of United Kingdom to Azerbaijan, and two of the Central Asian countries, Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. I believe Mr. Sharp's extensive experience across the Caspian region is going to be very crucial for our event today. And we are also joined by here today Ms. Natia Sescuria. She is an Associate Fellow at Royal United Services Institute. Her experience is on Russia's foreign policy, and also she's also founder of the Regional Institute of Security, if I'm not mistaken, and also she is focused on the South Caucasus and Black Sea security issues. We are also joined by Ms. Arzu Abbasova. She's also working at the Royal United Services Institute in financial crimes and security. Her expertise is on sanctions, financial issues, and also the economic aspects of modern statecraft. And finally, our discussion today is going to be moderated by my friend Victor Toporia, who is the International Communications Manager at GeoCase, an independent think tank, and also the founder and the CEO of Toporia Group. Victor is going to be guiding us through this very, I believe, going to be rich and intellectually intriguing discussion. Without further ado, I would like Victor to take over, but before doing that, I would like you to join me to welcome our guests.
Thank you, Raul, so much for organizing and for the intro. I had my own remarks, but I think they're going to be redundant after yours, so I'm going to put them aside. Thank you again to our panelists for being here. We're really excited. I'll say just one thing about organizing this. Obviously, we couldn't have done it without Raul. Thank you to Good Enough College. We recently launched our own company, Toporia Group, vainly named after myself. We're facilitating interconnectivity and trying to build trust between Europe and the Middle Corridor region, and this is one of our little public diplomacy efforts to do that, and I'm really grateful to you for being here and the panelists as well, so we'll get into it. First question I want to ask, I think it's important to kind of define our terms and frame the conversation. I want to address it to James. So when policymakers and business people talk about the Middle Corridor or the Greater Caspian region, what are they referring to exactly? Which countries and transit routes are clearly inside this framework, and which ones do they deliberately bypass?
I do some work nowadays for the Caspian Policy Centre. And we tend to talk about the Greater Caspian as really encompassing the 5 Central Asian countries, which if you want me to tell you which they are, that's fine, but and the 3 South Caucasus countries. But of course, on top of that, you then have to factor in other Caspian countries, Russia and Iran, and Turkey as a neighbouring country, and then of course China as a neighbouring country to some Central Asian countries. So broadly, it's those 8 countries, but you have to think about the influences elsewhere. In terms of the Middle Corridor, you can kind of partly define it by what it's not, and it's not the Northern Corridor. And this whole concept of Middle Corridor just came about because of 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and suddenly a lot of companies and countries didn't like the idea of shipping all the goods between China and Europe through the Northern Corridor rail route, which went all the way through Kazakhstan and then through Russia to Europe. And so the whole concept of the Middle Corridor was born. How can you sort of ship the stuff by rail that avoids Russia? And those rail lines existed already, and there's a whole collection of rail routes all the way through Central Asia. And so at that time, nothing new was built. Now there is more stuff being built. But it became a bit of a concept, the Middle Corridor, and the more formal title became the Trans-Caspian International Transit Route, to make the point that actually does go across the Caspian Sea. So it's not just a land-rail corridor, but it also includes the sea traffic across the Caspian. And I think what's fascinating about it is that from the genesis that actually we want a route that bypasses Russia, is now the realization has come that actually the main beneficiaries of the Middle Corridor are the actual countries themselves, the countries of the region, because the connectivity, it promotes the connectivity between the countries of Central Asia and the Caucasus, and it helps them develop, it helps them to trade with each other, and it then supports their economic development. So you've suddenly got what started off as a concept just for shipping goods between China and the EU, mainly from China to the EU, quite frankly. A lot of the cargoes go back empty. But it then became actually, this is all about the economic development of the countries of the region. And then beyond that, increasingly looking at it now as how it supports the sovereignty, the autonomy of these countries, how it gives them the ability, in a way, if you go back to the 1990s, the way that Azerbaijan built the Baku to Tbilisi oil pipeline that bypassed Russia. It went through Azerbaijan, Georgia, into Turkey, and then down to Ceyhan on the Mediterranean. It then gave Azerbaijan the ability, the autonomy to shape its own policy, if you like, and not be dependent upon Russia as an export route, as you find Kazakhstan is, for example. And so the Middle Corridor is now providing this opportunity to the countries. It actually gives them opportunities to connect with each other and connect with the outside world that doesn't go through Russia. So it sort of strengthens their sovereignty in a way. So it's really interesting. And then beyond that, you then think, okay, so the Middle Corridor, so once you start imagining the route, you realise it's not necessarily just a rail link, but you also think about green energy. Why wouldn't you export green energy from Kazakhstan across the Caspian, through Azerbaijan, Georgia, across the Black Sea to Romania or Bulgaria, which is now a big project? What about digital connectivity? Fibre optic cables now being laid under the Caspian, for example, between Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. So it completely changes the dynamics of connectivity within the region and between the region and the West, and then changes their whole philosophy. They're not now dependent upon Russia or China. They can actually look at other export routes and other opportunities. So it's actually fascinating the way that what was a reaction to the invasion of Ukraine, and just like we want another rail route, is now sort of transformed into actually something that's really very, very strategic.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you've broadly covered all the fascinating and strategic areas that the corridor covers, and I want to kind of switch to a more European perspective and a security perspective, and I want to direct this to Natia. So, I mean, James already mentioned, kind of alluded to the risks that this corridor avoids. Could you kind of discuss and elaborate what exactly those risks are currently, and also what new risks does this corridor introduce from a European security perspective specifically?
Sure. Thanks, first of all, for having us today. I think it's great
I forgot to mention that. Thanks for coming. Thanks so much for organising this. Back to you, Natia.
Thanks for taking your time at this late hours, and thanks for organizers for hosting this event. I think it's really important to talk about these issues that are very much crucial, not just for South Caucasus and Black Sea region, but also for wider European security. And I think to tackle your question, James has also mentioned this, but the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine really highlighted how important it is for European, for the EU, for Europeans in general, to pay more attention to regional connectivity and to diversification. And this issue has been becoming eventually one of the top priorities because of the vulnerabilities and threats that are connected to the so-called northern route. I guess the main underlining reason behind Europeans placing more emphasis, and this has been also highlighted in the EU's Black Sea strategy, rather approach, I would say, that for the years to come, EU intends to invest more and to also tackle and help empower local regional states to to cope with some of the challenges and threats that are coming, not from Russia, but also from actors such as Iran, that feel directly threatened by the Middle Corridor ambitions and aspirations and plans. So most importantly, as James mentioned, it reduces Europe's most pressing connectivity vulnerabilities created by Russia, but it also creates a new layer of political and security challenges in the Black Sea and South Caucasus. This is the non-Russian bridge, and that bypasses the northern route, and I think it places the South Caucasus countries strategically in a very important place to finally position themselves as strategically important for the European security, something that three countries have struggled quite a lot to highlight in various conversations and strategic discussions with the Europeans. And diversification away from the Black Sea choke points under the Russian pressure would remain one of the key priorities, whether or not we will see immediate peace deal, or I have my views and quite pessimistic ones with regards to the peace deal, but that's a different topic. But no matter how the war in Ukraine will end and when the war will end, this particular area of connectivity will remain one of the key priority areas for Russia. So when it comes to threats, of course, it needs to be noted that sabotage operations, for example, threatening the infrastructure projects that are quite ambitious ones when it comes to Middle Corridor trip, which is directly linked to the part of the Middle Corridor, are something that are very important, and the EU is still kind of struggling to come up with a viable plan on how to cope with these sabotage attempts. Again, not coming just from Russia, but also another nation which is particularly concerned about these plans is Iran, which is kind of staying out of this massive infrastructure plans that are involved with Middle Corridor. But also when it comes to China's role, that is quite important, because China has quite ambiguous sort of aspirations. We see that Chinese investments have been gradually increasing in the region, in the South Caucasus, in the Black Sea. But when it comes to EU's perspective, I think if the EU will sort of underinvest in this area, then we will see more growing influence of China in the region, something that the EU and ultimately, of course, Trump administration's interests are a whole different area of discussion, but ultimately, if we can frame it, generalize in a bit, it may threaten Western interest in this region. So that is another point which needs to be taken into consideration. When it comes to risks directly related to the region, of course, this is the region, and particularly I'm talking about South Caucasus right now, that is very much influenced by various domestic vulnerabilities in different countries. We have on the one hand Georgia, which is going through very turbulent times. We have Armenia, which has various challenges right now, and as the elections are coming up, of course, there is more incentives from the Russian side to play a damaging role domestically. And I think this general volatility and vulnerabilities raises the threat landscape, which is something that the EU has been quite struggling with, I should say, to have more proactive role in terms of being a key player in the region, but also to, for instance, I mentioned Georgia, and I think it is still very much unclear what is the EU stance, or if there is, I doubt there is any strategy even, but how to deal with the these sort of domestic challenges that ultimately may threaten wider regional aspirations that EU may have in this area. So I think to kind of sum up, there are various structural challenges apart from obvious advantages that Middle Corridor has. And these structural challenges are maybe divided into maybe a couple of sections. Firstly, it's the regional landscape, which is still challenging because Russia is playing still, even though we see Russia being militarily quite weakened, it still has capacity to undermine the interest of the regional countries through various hybrid activities. It is a main player when it comes to playing a disruptive role with its sabotage operations. There has been various evidence of it in the past, and the risk of weaponization of these domestic vulnerabilities. Russia is quite skilled at this. And finally, as I mentioned, the role of China, which still is, there are loads of question marks, I guess, in what kind of framework and how China wants to position itself in the region.
Thank you so much. I mean, you mentioned so many things that are worth a deep dive, and I'm sure we'll have, we're going to get into it a little farther down the panel. But I want to bring Arzu into this because you mentioned European investments and ramping up European investments in the region. And one of the things that kind of characterize the Middle Corridor is an abundance of shadow capital flows, financial crimes, and vehicles for sanctions evasion. I'm just curious. How embedded are these risks in the region's political economy, and what do these activities look like in practice? And I guess how can EU institutional investors approach these risks in the region?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I don't think the Middle Corridor is necessarily too much related to or associated with the financial crime, or at least it's not inherent to the Middle Corridor. Every trade route has its problems with financial crime, obviously, and so is Middle Corridor. So what I would say is what we're really seeing is the interaction between these rapid connectivity issues, but also as you said, there are some structural vulnerabilities, of course, in the political economies of these countries in terms of, fighting against financial crime, if we're looking at it that way. I mean, I think it's no major news if I break it that both the South Caucasus countries and the Central Asian countries, they have their issues with several financial crimes, ranging from corruption to,
Really? I would say I need to sit down, were it not for the fact I'm sitting down already.
To state business entanglement and to other AML-CFT weaknesses. For those who don't know, AML-CFT stands for anti-money laundering or counter-terrorist financing weaknesses. I think when we judge it in terms of Middle Corridor, we have to look at the two sides of the coin. On first one is really tackling this financial crime issues, or let's say the AML-CFT deficiencies, really would be very crucial for the operation of the Middle Corridor. Now, we haven't until now mentioned that although Middle Corridor is is the concept that is right now also happening in practice as well, there are a lot of bottlenecks that needs to be talked about. Some of those bottlenecks are very hard to tackle because of, some of them are, practically speaking, natural issues like Caspian shrinking, winter being so harsh, or the Caspian Sea having a lot of winds. So those are very hard to challenge or hard to tackle. But there are other issues that are more soft infrastructure issues, such as aligning the tax systems, aligning, the bureaucracy around this country so that the trade route is very much aligned and very much, operating. Now here comes the tackling the financial crime issues, because obviously if the corruption is high, it will be very hard for the businesses to choose this route to kind of get their trade throughout the corridor. But on the other side of the coin, I realize why you mentioned the question, because of how the sanctions circumvention particularly has come up in the conversations around, Middle Corridor countries. Some of the some of the countries in the region has been named, in terms of the sanctions circumvention. I think we already talked about 2022 and its importance, particularly for the middle corridor, but what it actually did, and as mentioned before by my colleagues, is that it really diverted the trade from, some of the trade from northern corridor to the middle corridor. Just looking at the trade volumes back in 2022, I believe it was around, trade was around 580,000 tons, and the numbers are standing at 4.5 million in 2024. And if we look at the northern corridor, we can see that from 2022 to 2023, the trade volume has decreased around like 50%. But by trade volume, I mean the trade that is going westbound. So we can see that a lot of the trade has been rerouted, so it's very natural that it comes to the middle corridor. But here we're also seeing, a lot of like re-exporting, or we're seeing some other circumvention tactics like falsified end-user documentation, sometimes indirect deliveries, and so on. I mean, I'm not going to name countries, but those are very open materials that we've seen in some countries rise in the trade of microchips, for example, right after the war, and these are not very small numbers. One of the countries where the exports of microchips was around $245,000. Within 1 year, it raised into $80 million. So we can see that the numbers are big, and we're seeing some activities that are going on the route. But that being said, I also have to caveat two things. First of all, the countries on the middle corridor or in the region overall, talking about it, they're not necessarily legally bounded by the US or UK or EU sanctions against Russia. That's one thing to remember. But at the same time, there's also quite a lot of pressure on them to abide by the sanctions and kind of to keep the neutral ground. A very recent example, particularly pertaining to the countries in the middle corridor, is June 2025. UK issued a specific guidance to Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, calling them that any indirect exposure to Russia could result in kind of commercial isolation, and it's something to remember. There's two realities, that those countries, all of those countries, have very big trade volumes with Russia, but at the same time they're really trying to kind of keep in between the pressure from the West, from the EU, from US, and from other governments as well. So I think, just to wrap up, what I'm trying to say is that there are some financial crime threats and risks, and they are real, but they are also not unique. I think here the real policy challenge is ensuring that the connectivity does not really outpace the accountability, because if those illicit finance practices become kind of embedded in the trade route, it will be very hard to fight against them, and it will be very hard to unwind them.
Thank you so much. I think just my takeaway from hearing the three of you is that, I mean, at the high level, anytime we talk about a place that's at the intersection of so many great powers, where so many different interests collide, they're going to find a great deal of complexity in all these realms. And if possible, I'd like to just kind of elevate the conversation a little bit and bring it back to kind of Europe's geopolitical awakening, say, and reframe this region as a strategic area, an area of strategic competition, because both the South Caucasus and Central Asia historically have been caught at the intersection of these great Eurasian empires, and they've never been viewed as places that have much agency of their own. At the same time, these regions are integral to what geopolitical theorists call the Eurasian heartland, and I think it's one of the guiding theories of the realist school of geopolitics, and it's influenced a lot of American foreign policy, Russian foreign policy, and even Chinese foreign policy. So I want to direct this to James. In an article last year in the Caspian Policy Center's publication, you wrote that heartland theory has made a comeback in global geopolitics. I just want you to briefly summarize what this theory is all about, and how has it reflected the behavior of great powers throughout history, and how can it help us better understand the modern strategic landscape of both the South Caucasus and Central Asia?
It's a fascinating theory. It all dates back to 1904, and sort of English geographer called Halford Mackinder. And this was a time when British naval supremacy underpinned the British Empire, the global British Empire. And is also the time when the Trans-Siberian Railway was completed. And he kind of looked at all of this whole geopolitical picture, and looking back to history, recognizing that actually so many of the world's empires came from Central Asia, came from Eurasia. If you look at the Seljuks, the Ottomans, the Mughals, the Mongols, all of them came from that region and just spread out on their horses, riding across the flat steppe and destroying everything in their path in most cases. But that was, so then formed the conclusion, I suppose, that actually once you start building railways over this whole territory, because if it's good for horses, it's good for railways as well. So once you start building railways, you can dominate the resources of this huge landmass, this whole Eurasian landmass. Eurasia being Europe and Asia, but starting in the middle, if you like, as all of these sort of the horse-riding invasion forces had. So you then dominate the whole of Eurasia, and that was the heartland theory, the heartland of Eurasia, which was then gave you the ability to dominate the whole world. And I think that it probably underpinned some of the aspects of World War I, and particularly World War II. And sort of Germany was sort of driving into Russia, and Japan was trying to sort of capture China. So sort of a pincer movement between the Axis powers to sort of take control of the whole of Eurasia. But it's just one theory, of course, and there's another theory thereafter called the Rimland theory, which was actually you don't need to control Eurasia, you don't need to control the heartland, you can control the coastlines, if you like, and control the sea lanes. And that then became, I suppose, more popular, and also became the basis for the US containment strategy for the Soviet Union. And of course, at that time as well, you had the situation where, for the first time in history, the world's preeminent power was not based in Eurasia, but the United States, of course, was effectively its own continent. So a lot of sort of rethinking of the heartland strategy. But the reason it's become, I suppose, more into vogue nowadays is you see the Russian invasion of Ukraine sort of to drive westwards, and sort of concerns about wider European security. And at the same time, you see the increasing Chinese assertiveness over the last 10 years or so, and sort of really trying to build strategic depth, which has always been historically part of the Chinese Empire's strategy. And that depth then going further and further west, if you like, and the Belt and Road Initiative, or the Silk, whatever it was called, I'm not quite sure, the Silk BRI, is part of that, really. It's just to really bind all of these areas into the Chinese sphere, really. So that's kind of what's kind of really brought this theory to the fore again, when you've got two effectively autocratic states starting to dominate the whole of that part of Eurasia, just concerned about what does that mean for global stability and what have you. So as I say, it's just one theory amongst many, but it's quite interesting if you look at it in the context of Chinese and Russian actions over the last few years.
Well, you mentioned the United States, and even though it's not on the Eurasian continent, it's still kind of operating by this theory. And maybe you can't associate any, highbrow theoretical prowess to the Trump administration,
Nope.
but nevertheless, you see U.S. engagement in the region quite heavily. I think the biggest example we saw recently was the U.S.-mediated peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and the opening of the Trump route for international peace and prosperity, which is one of the key pathways on the Middle Corridor now. Natia, you wrote last year in the Financial Times that this agreement actually has the potential to transform the region, but then in your opening remarks you had some skepticism about that. So
make up your mind, Natia. Come on.
I'll try.
I want to hear what you have to say about how these developments have reshaped the balance of power in the Caucasus, and also maybe comment on how regional actors like Russia and Turkey are affected by this.
Well, I do still believe that there is a potential there, but allow me to also express some skepticism. As a researcher, I should be skeptical about these things. As much as I do believe that the aim that U.S. administration has with the trip is mainly opportunistic, I think Trump sees there it's sort of a low-hanging fruit for Trump administration, because he saw that the processes were already advancing to a certain level, and then he suddenly decided that while things in Ukraine, his peacemaking efforts are not leading him anywhere, at least
Yes,
anywhere
yes,
closer
yes.
to Nobel Peace Prize. This may be a sort of a low investment a strategy to claim that he has ended yet another war. So yet I do think that it is very important to have US interest in the region, because I do have also fair amount of skepticism with regards to Biden administration's engagement with this region, or lack of engagement to be more precise, but also during first Trump administration we didn't really see much emphasis on the Black Sea or South Caucasus, and this is really a first effort to bring in American interest in the region. And whether or not this is purely opportunistic idea from Trump's side, it does go against Russian interest in the region. And we do see that there is a tendency to decrease Russian influence in the region, at least from the Armenian side. There are, I think there are three separate stories going on there. Firstly, of course, Azerbaijan is much more assertive in its foreign policy, and it has a multi-vectoral foreign policy, but also it does see itself as a self-sustained actor in the region. And a relationship with Russia is very different from what we see in case of Armenia or Georgia. It is much more sort of economic based and less and more sort of focused on diversification, and Baku does see itself as a self-sustained actor in the region, especially since the recent developments and subsequently the weakening of Russia as a regional power as a result of the war in Ukraine. When it comes to Armenia, we see that the traditional relationships are shifting very swiftly, because Armenians do not really see Russia as a reliable partner. Firstly, because of their experience, but also because they see that Russia is very much invested in Ukraine right now, and this may be a strategic opportunity for Armenia to get closer with the Europeans. And we see some sort of conversations about something that reminds me very much early days when Georgia was trying to forge closer relations, seek visa liberalization, for instance, and further sort of closeness with the European integration aspirations. And thirdly, less promising case, unfortunately, the case of Georgia, where we see that there is a shifting dynamics from being a very proactively and vocally pro-European state. We see the shift in policy. But overall, if we can sort of draw the conclusions out of these three cases, we see that Russian influence is on the diminishing side. There is the regional dynamics is becoming more multipolar, and it's not only just Russia there. That will of course remain the key interested side to project power in this region, but also we see China, for instance, becoming more interested in investing, including in areas that are strategically important, such as the case of Anaklia port in Georgia, for example. But overall, I think if Americans are really serious about TRIP, about regional connectivity, about projecting their power in the region, this could be one way in which Russian influence can be diminished in this region. This could ultimately have positive impact on Georgia, which is, as I mentioned, not on the positive track right now. But my skepticism comes from the fact that, of course, there was a lot of praising of Trump administration when the Washington summit happened, and from PR perspective, it was a big move for the region itself. But When it comes to threats, security risks, the stakes are very high. I mentioned the threat of sabotage, for example, and when it comes to STRIP, we are talking about very ambitious connectivity projects. And as ambitious these projects are, the risks of sabotage are higher. And this includes various sort of maneuvering space, a vast maneuvering space for Russia and Iran to act and to sort of play a role of a spoiler. But when it comes to Washington and how they are planning to securitize TRIP in a way, there is not much vision behind, at least what we see so far. So I think when it comes to this cannot be purely economic project and purely transactional projects, something that Trump likes very much. There are layers of threats that need to be taken into consideration, and there needs to be these economic aspirations needs to be followed by security strategy. So something that we haven't seen so far, and this is by all means. I do not think that this is something simple. This would involve much closer engagement from the U.S. side with the regional actors, as well as to long-term strategy. But I'm not so sure that there is so far some work done when it comes to security side of these plans.
You mentioned the rising regionalist tendencies and this being a way to diversify against the powers of both Russia and China, and maybe there's a lack of vision from the US or maybe Europe, but James, I want to direct this to you. Do you think there is some sort of vision internally within these regions about the potential of regional integration? Maybe, this is quite aspirational, but maybe not so distant future, having something that's more EU style, beginning with economic integration, then regulatory integration, seeing that in, say, Central Asia or eventually in the Caucasus. Is that something that you can imagine in the near future, or is that just not even worth talking about? Is that far, far away?
Well, there's quite a range of options you just listed, I have to say. I don't quite think they're ready for EU-style integration, quite frankly. I think ASEAN's been having a go at that for the last 50 years or something, hasn't really managed to get beyond step 2. So, but yeah, it's more about cooperation and integration for the time being. But certainly, yes. It's interesting actually, because when I was an ambassador in Kazakhstan, as ambassadors, we say to London, "Don't treat us as a bloc. We're all different. We're individuals. We all have different attributes and what have you. So treat us differently." But now you see all the ambassadors saying, "Hey, treat us as a bloc," because you get more traction if you're like the C5+1 format. Right. Now, of course, it's C6+1 format. There's actually a C5+1 foreign ministers meeting taking place in London tomorrow, as it happens. So the British Foreign Office has finally got in on the C5 Act, and so we'll be having our show tomorrow. But we forgot to include Azerbaijan, but so it's just C5 for the time being. But this is, I think, again, it's one of the things that's come about largely as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And you've suddenly got the countries saying, "Oh my God, what do we do now?" A kind of a slight opportunity to move away from Russia. B, you've also got a world more generally which is seeing the rise of multipolarity. We've heard a lot about that, of course, so it's not just about America anymore, it's about China, India, Turkey, Russia, you name it. And then C, you've got the middle corridor, which is then becoming a tangible reason for them to work together and cooperate. So it's interesting is that all of these are driving the 5 Central Asian countries. I'm talking about Central Asia here. It's driving the 5 Central Asian countries towards greater cooperation amongst themselves. And as we was talking about the connectivity issues, both soft connectivity, you have to get the regulatory framework right, customs, tariffs, all of that sort of stuff, and hard connectivity, which is the railroads themselves and the ports and what have you. Again, thinking about the lack of sea in the Caspian Sea, for example, being one of the conundrums there. They build a road instead, so it might save a bit of money. They won't need ships anymore. But all of these things are now forcing the countries to work together in practical ways, which just we hadn't really envisaged very much before. And yes, they're driving countries. Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan tend to be the main drivers of this. But it's bringing together all of the C5 and C6 together. And clearly, it will go beyond that because water and energy is again a big issue. Has been ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. There's been quite a lot of bad blood between the Central Asian countries on water usage. So the two main rivers, there's 2 upstream states in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, and 3 downstream states. And there's the downstream states which are kind of just using all the water to grow cotton, which is a completely stupid thing to do in the desert, but they are doing that. And that's what I can talk about. If you want, I can talk about cotton in Central Asia if you really want as well, but the history of that. But again, it's very interesting. But so these problems, now stand more chance of being resolved, I think, in sort of a cooperative fashion. So I think it's really, really positive again that these mega trends that are happening are now sort of generating greater cooperation. In the South Caucasus, bit of a different story, but again, you talked about Azerbaijan, Armenia peace treaty. I've always been very optimistic since 2020 that there would be a proper peace treaty, and I think that's going to happen, quite frankly. I guess there's lots of issues to be sorted out still, including the Armenian elections on June the 7th, and then the constitutional referendum sometime later. However, hopefully we'll get over those hurdles. And I think that then really opens up the opportunities for the South Caucasus again, because I think there's been such strategic failure by the European Union to get a grip on the South Caucasus, quite frankly. It's part of the European neighbourhood, but they've been totally absent from the Caucasus, and they've just got, we can go into that later if you want, but now, once you start to open up through, if you start to open up TRIP, branch of the middle corridor through an Azerbaijan-Armenia peace agreement, and then it kind of feels to me the EU should then be really jumping in there to do what the EU is actually normally pretty good at, which is promoting regional connectivity and regional economic development, because those 3 countries just really, they need to be working together and cooperating together, because they're all small countries, not very close to anywhere, and they just need it for the sake of long-term economic development. So I kind of feel very positive, actually, the better changes that are taking place.
Yeah, and I think that's a much more grounded answer than what my question was leading you to give, which I appreciate. Arzu, I want to get your thoughts on what James just said, and maybe give us some more context on the financial implication of this, and what could this increased potential integration mean for the region's economic autonomy, but also what does it mean for their potential dependencies on outside actors like China, Russia, or even the Gulf countries or India?
Yeah, thank you. I think James really touched upon the right points, so I will kind of develop on what he said.
It's always very intimidating when you sitting beside an Azerbaijan and a Georgian and you talk about their countries. Just like, hey, I keep looking at them. Have I got this right?
No, I think you made great comments. I took a few quotes that I'm going to cite them. So, James, you're now being quoted. He said,
just make sure you attribute it to me, okay?
Definitely, attributing it to James. Quote. He said that there is tangible reason to work together, and I think this hasn't been more correct, particularly in the conversations around Middle Corridor. So what we didn't, I guess, mention at the beginning is, in technicality or on paper, what Middle Corridor is it is the shortest strait between China and Europe, kind of connecting China to Europe. But I've been to most of the Middle Corridor countries, having conversations with the stakeholders and interlocutors. When I asked them, what is Middle Corridor? No one has really said that, it's a trade route that is bringing together China and Europe. They were all about, how Middle Corridor is going to contribute to their economy, contribute to their trade, contribute to, their economic independence and development. So that kind of shows how overall Middle Corridor is framed in terms of connectivity, in terms of deeper economic and regional integration. I think what's very important to mention, and I really liked it was mentioned at the CPC event last week, Caspian Post Center event last week. Someone said that before this, we were always talking about, both of these regions as peripheries or backyards of something. Now, James just mentioned, South Caucasus used to be Europe's backyard. It literally is how we, called these regions either Russia's backyards or Europe's backyard. But I think with the current momentum that is up there, it's the first time that they're kind of taking the opportunity to be more of a strategic actors of their own rather than being someone's backyard. And here also the change in the conceptualization of how the region should be viewed, I think it's quite important. Now C5 becoming C6 really changes how the countries and how the outside actors engage with the region, both the UK, the US, and other actors as well. I mean, you like to always mention that UK's trade envoy is now called Central Asia plus Azerbaijan, which is a very great example of how the strategic thinking is changing around the region. But that being said, there are some. I was looking up, some data and facts to just make this exactly to make it more interesting. But the IMF was saying that all of these countries are actually trading 15 to 20% below what they could have traded with each other. I'm trying to say or bring this argument to support the fact that there's still a lot more potential and ways for further deeper integration and economic interdependence. Now, Natia mentioned this quite a lot, but obviously the economic interdependence, the trade volumes also have implications for the peace. Both sides of the Caspian, actually. On one side, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and on the other side, obviously, the whole peace and stability of the Central Asia region. And we have seen this economic and trade being used in the exemplification of peace. One example being, the wheat that just is being transferred from Kazakhstan to Armenia via Azerbaijan was a great example of, peace not only narrative, but peace in real life and in practice, how it would look. But I also want to make it a little bit more challenging and bring more critical ideas on the conversation by saying that there could be also in the long term some frictions. It will depend on how these countries on the middle corridor and beyond in the region really manage those kind of frictions. One example being, for example, in December, a couple of months ago, Azerbaijan started selling fuel to Armenia and it went through Georgia, right? What happened was that Georgia raised the tariffs, and then it was a little bit of a friction moment. There was some, reactions from both sides. It was resolved very quickly, obviously. They moved on. Now everything is fine. The trade is continuing as it is. But all I'm saying is that when we're looking at the economic interdependence and economic connectivity, we have to look into, in the long term, how they really have to, balance between each other. Because there might be scenarios that this integration also creates new areas for competition of who's the regional leader, or some control issues, pricing control issues, or leadership issues, which we really need to be aware of. And that really changes, that relates to the second part of your question, on the region's stance towards other actors like Russia or China, and seeing how the connected new region really offers alternative to trade in terms of Russia or in terms of China. I mean, the regional economic interdependence really does not change much towards the relationship, at least the trade relationships between Russia and China. They will, I believe, they will still have their own roles, but it obviously shapes, to the extent that these relationships can go or not. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now, but happy to come back.
Would either of you like to add something to that?
I would just like to add, I didn't say backyard, I actually said neighbourhood, which I think is a much more friendly term.
That is actually correct.
Term, yeah.
I'll try to quote James better.
I just want to be mindful of time. I think it's important that in this last section we bring back the conversation to Western engagement and European agency. We're coming off two very important global conferences now. Natia was actually just in Munich. And I think the overarching theme of it was Europe's awakening as a geopolitical actor and projecting power on a different scale than it used to.
Not much focus on middle corridor, South Caucasus,
yes.
though, which was something I'm also skeptical about.
Well, it seems more like an ambition than a strategy. Perhaps this is our way of making it a little more concrete and saying, to pay attention to this region. First to James, but then also to Natia as well. Briefly, if Europe is actually serious about being a geopolitical actor, and if the middle corridor is its strategic space, what does genuine engagement look like on a practical level? For institutions, for capital flow, for political risk taking, and where should Europe be willing to truly compete? And what does that look like?
Briefly. Let me be honest. The EU is not a geopolitical actor. I mean, seriously, whatever you hear and whatever they say, this is an organisation with 27 member states, an incredibly legalistic approach towards things, very plodding, ponderous approach in a lot of it. It can't do geopolitics, very, very rarely. It doesn't have a geopolitical strategy towards Central Asia. It has an issues-based one, middle corridor, economic development, critical minerals, you name it. The global gateway, you could say, hey, the global gateway is a geopolitical approach to combat the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, not really. It's just something the EU wants to do anyway to help the development of these countries, which, of course, actually may end up making it easier for China to import stuff from Central Asia rather than making it easier for the EU to import stuff. Having said that, in the South Caucasus, again, the EU doesn't really do geopolitics, but I would actually probably suggest that the EU's approach towards Georgia has sort of a bit of geopolitics around it. I mean, not now, but previously when it was actually helping Georgia to draw closer to the European Union and NATO. That's geopolitics. That's really, you could argue there's an element of values-based policy there, but it's geopolitics in the sense of really showing that countries can escape from the Russian orbit. We went through this in the early 1990s with the Baltic states, who really just, wanted to get out of the Russian orbit completely, and there was very much I worked on those countries at the time, and the real sense of just showing actually they were Western, if you like, and they were looking west, not looking eastwards, and the Russians were desperately trying to sort of claw them back, if you like, and keep them within their orbit. So Georgia was very much the same, actually showing you can actually have a country that wants to be part of the West, and it will be part of the West, and we're going to help it be part of the West. That, of course, lies in tatters, that whole... So there we go. As I said, the EU is not very good at geopolitics, and it messed up. It didn't mess up in Georgia. I mean, Nacho can tell you much more about why what happened in Georgia happened. But the fact now is that the EU doesn't really have a policy at all on Georgia. It doesn't know what to do. I mean, I think I would just describe it as strategic paralysis, quite frankly. It also doesn't have a geopolitical approach towards Azerbaijan and Armenia, quite honestly. It's just been previously it was about conflict management, and that was about it. It then got involved, which was really good in terms of post-2020 and helping to mediate, and it then basically ruled itself out of the game by taking sides. And a fascinating thing, we're talking about 27 member states, the way that the domestic politics of one member state, i.e. France, can actually destroy EU policy towards Azerbaijan and Armenia was quite incredible. But that's kind of a symptom of the EU. It can get wrecked by just domestic issues in one country. Sorry, not very optimistic scenario. Also, I'll just add geography matters. Yeah. Central Asia is a long way away from the EU. It's very close to China. It's very close to Russia, and time matters as well. And EU member states will never have the time or the energy to have a high-level dialogue on a continuous basis with these countries in the way that Russia and China can.
Yeah, it's pessimistic, and as a Georgian, it's hard to be optimistic in this time. And I'd like to bring Natia into this. I mean, obviously, James expressed a lot of skepticism about Europe being a coherent strategic actor, but I think from one Georgian to another, I think a lot of Georgians saw themselves as kind of European outposts in the region. Like they saw themselves as the front line of Europe in this region most of the world does not see as Europe. So we were kind of more optimistic about what your European future could look like, and that's kind of diminished or hopefully not disappeared. But I'm just curious, what do you think is the biggest obstacle for Europe to operate as a coherent, unified actor? And Georgia maybe was a really good case in the mid-2000s, early 2000s, and how can that energy be brought back?
Mm-hmm. Well, I very much agree with what James has said. I think the coherent approach, sort of basis of forming coherent approach would be to have some sort of strategy on how to approach the region. Beyond what already has been tried and tested, which is, and I mean, I'm a biggest proponent of European integration when it comes to Georgia, but I think beyond the integration aspirations, promotion of values, democratic reforms and so on, these are very important, but at the same time there needs to be some sort of regional strategy and on how to let's split it two ways. Firstly, on how to deal with some of the strategic challenges in the region, because we see EU has absolutely failed to deal with these challenges that are very much present currently, and Georgia is a great example of it. Still, the country has been in crisis for more than 2 years, and we don't really see what the EU is going to do. It is partly due to the fact that, as James mentioned, there is no unanimity when it comes to when it comes to priorities of individual nations and how they see some of the challenges or the importance of the challenges to the European security and wider European perspective. And secondly, I think the sort of lack of prioritization of having more sort of strategic posture in the region, which is partly due to the fact that EU has a lot on its plate right now, and there are immediate challenges that the EU is faced due to the war in Ukraine. And even when it comes to that, we see that decision making has been very tough and very difficult. So it's a very sort of I think the way in which the EU has been trying to deal with some of the challenges is very outdated in a way, and it's very it's not focused on long-term solutions. So I think the need of strategy would be one of the key priority areas that I would highlight from the EU's perspective. We saw that the EU has developed the Black Sea approach, but even with that, it was good that we saw that there was a particular section that was framing South Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia as one of the key priority areas, and the engagement and direct communication with these countries when it comes to some of the common challenges and opportunities. But at the same time, I think I was involved in various formats discussing this approach, and there were lots of countries that have found it quite sort of superficial, even the fact itself that there was no wider consultation with the immediate regional states, and by that I mean Black Sea littoral states, on the key priority areas that these states think is crucial from the EU's perspective. So there are lots of challenges, and I think lots of deficiencies, shortfalls that we see in this strategy. It's still a good starting point, but I think given the importance of this region as well as the current threat landscape, there needs to be more quick decision making, and the starting point would be the formation of strategic vision towards the region.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to bring Arzu's perspective in on this, but more from a financial, more private sector in perspective, I guess. I mean, obviously there's a lot of risk from the security side, but also European companies, investors, banks, they are, of course, view this region as very risky. We talked about this earlier, but do you think adjusting risk appetite or adjusting entry thresholds into these markets, into the middle corridor, which may be perceived and also in reality has some sort of, a lot of, corruption or shadow finance flows. I'm just curious, let me just find the exact, how I have the phrasing here. Yes, so do you think the private sector should rethink its entry thresholds into these markets? And do you think they can compete in this region without normalizing opacity? If that makes sense.
I get all of the hard questions today.
Oh,
But you're the smartest person here.
Come on, James. Now, this time I'll quote James. This time I'll quote James, right? He said, it's a strategic paralysis, James. I wrote to quote you in terms of you. But, I mean, I will not comment on whether you use a strategic paralysis or not. Nate and James have already given a very good, kind of response to that. But what I want to say about EU's approach to the middle corridor is I would want to say that they are late to the game, as they are late to many things in the region. I think, let alone you, like, let's talk a little bit on the European side, and particularly regarding the sanctions and so on. I think because just what Natia said and James said, there's not enough leverage, and that really shows itself in the conversations that's happening around the region and what I've been talking about in terms of the financial crime perspective and all of that. I think there's also a little bit of balancing from their side as well. Like, I want to bring an example from the UK. UK in October imposed sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, but at the same time it kind of exempted it. It not necessarily like it temporarily introduced some kind of exemptions to key energy projects in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan for the Caspian pipeline consortium, for the Tengiz Chevroil and for Shah Deniz and so on. So it's kind of like saying that, you know, there's some kind of engagement, even in terms of the questions that they have in mind. There's still some ways in European countries really are appreciating the energy diversification that is coming from the region. That being said, in terms of how they should engage with the region, particularly for the financial crime issues that we just talked about, we published at RUSI a commentary actually together with Olivia Allison, and there we were arguing that there is specific notes that you should really take advantage of if it really wants the corridor, you know, to be operating in the way that it will be both efficient and transparent. And one of the keynotes that EU kind of can introduce itself is helping to digitize and automate the customs declaration and other trade procedures. And with that, EU can be more actively taking part in the digital trade corridor, as we call it. This way, it would really ensure both, you know, fighting against corruption and so on, but at the same time, you know, keeping and preserving the EU interests in the middle corridor. The second point that I would like to mention is there's a need for the EU to engage more with the small and medium enterprises in the region, particularly because their activity has resulted in the most opaque, activities that are happening on the ground. So it's very important for the EU to strengthen and kind of to have incentives for these SMEs to cooperate with the European partners. In terms of the other more practical arrangements, I think it's very important for the EU policymakers to listen to the people on the ground and to see what they actually want and kind of come from that perspective as well. When I was talking to the stakeholders in the region, for example, the logistics companies, the first thing that they said that we really want the visa issue to be solved. Because EU has, like, it's a very practical, it's a very basic issue. EU has not enough truck drivers. Let's say the Turkey has quite a lot of truck drivers, but they need European visa to just go to the Europe. If the goods have to be delivered to the UK, they need additional UK visa. It causes quite a lot of like logistical issues, and that really turns them to turn the trade away. If you want the middle corridor to be a success, it also has to, you know, contribute or make it easier in the way that it could very easily. The second issue, I don't think this is a very easily solvable issue, but it's a kind of a big issue that is out there, that if you look at the trade volumes on how it is going, you would note that the trade is really moving from east to west, like from China or from Central Asia countries towards the west. But there's really not enough trade from west to come to the east, and those trains or those buses or whatever, they're actually carrying goods towards the Europe, but they're not bringing anything back, and that's causing quite a lot of, you know, issues in terms of like how much these logistics companies can afford to bring back, because they're not making any money when they're coming back. So those are very, very it looks like there are big issues, but they're trickling down to very, very practical matters that can be solved, or requires actually some kind of a EU solution at least. And the last thing is obviously regarding investment. We talked about the investment from different actors on the middle corridor, and it's quite important for the EU to have the investments as well, and it has pledged some actually quite big sums. But at what rate that investment is going to be, if it is in terms of like credit, that's also quite important, because What makes middle corridor the route to be chosen by any businesses? It is first the time and second the cost. If we are increasing the costs by putting that much of money into infrastructure that these countries have to pay back or whatever, then if it's costly, still the companies will not choose the costly road. They will still choose the road that is less costly, less time friendly. So this is a very practical challenge in terms of like how companies choose it. I mean, to very much summarize, that without meaningful engagement and really thinking about what's going on in the ground and how they need to contribute, EU is neither present in the strategy as mentioned before, but they're also not present in the practice, and it will be very hard to kind of involve themselves.
Right. And I think you hit on a really important point that so much of it is about practicalities and self-interest and whether things tangibly improve people's lives or profits or whatever it is. And I think maybe one of the areas where the U.S. is ahead, but at the same time it creates risks, is that it is more, recently its foreign policy is more transactional, interest-driven, and less values-driven than it has been previously. Based on that, do you think, James, I'm going to have to direct this to you, at this junction, when we see this shift toward transactional politics, do you think European and American interests in this region, in the middle corridor, remain aligned, or are we seeing signs of strategic divergence?
I mean, any foreign policy has a mixture of geopolitics, narrow interests, maybe commercial, maybe defence, security, and then values. And that's just a fact of life, and you can't ascribe one particular country to a particular policy. It's always a mixture. I think what's interesting is, I think I've already dismissed the idea that the EU has a geopolitical approach, but it always likes to think it has a values-based approach, and you hear quite a lot of that. But does it? I mean, Central Asians get a free pass on values, as does Algeria and the Gulf states and what have you. EU tends to, when it focuses on any of these countries in terms of values, it tends to focus on the South Caucasus. The Americans have had traditionally more of a geopolitical approach towards the wider region generally, but also they have very clear interests. And there has been, as you identified, there has been quite a big shift in American policy. I don't really think they do geopolitics much in the region anymore, quite frankly. I think that's a mistake, but they are very focused on very narrow short-term interests right now. I mean, the good thing so far is that those narrow short-term interests have actually, fortunately, coincided with wider European interests. So there hasn't been the strategic divergence as such yet. And what the Americans did on Azerbaijan, Armenia, and on Trip is fantastic. They just made it happen. Yes, you're right. I mean, basically the peace treaty was there already to be signed, and they sort of grabbed the opportunity. But I think providing the cover for agreement on the trip, if you like, the Nakhchivan link or the Zangezur corridor, whatever you want to call it, that was kind of the final push that was needed, I think, to get that over the line, sort of over the line. So it's been quite interesting is that they have actually focused on very small things, but those small things have actually added value to what generally we want in terms of issues in geopolitics as well. The jury's out as to what will happen next. I think, but in Central Asia, what will be the main American interest there? Probably critical minerals, quite frankly. But they've just set up yet another organisation to work with close, like-minded partners to look at critical minerals worldwide, to sort of gain access to critical minerals and processing worldwide. And that's again a positive thing. So it's driven by narrow American interests, but they are involving partners in that. So, I mean, oddly, so far so good is what I would say, rather than strategic divergence. I think there's been kind of quite a strange strategic convergence, even though it hasn't been designed that way. But let's see.
Yeah, I suppose progress does not necessarily need good intentions to take place.
I think one of the biggest issues will be what, if anything, the Americans do with Georgia. Because they've been pretty much silent so far. But if they suddenly find some sort of commercial deal or some sort of deal which enhances Trump, then that could actually completely undermine European Union policy towards Georgia and lead
working on that.
Georgia. You're working on undermining EU policy. So that could be a potential point of contention.
Thank you so much. And I know it's getting very late, so I just wanted to ask one last question, see if you can answer it very briefly, just so we can close out this panel, and then we'll open it up to questions if there are any. Just to all three of you, looking 5-10 years into the future, what do you think the middle corridor is going to look like? Do you think it's going to be a strategic lifeline for Europe, or is it going to become a missed opportunity, or has it already become a missed opportunity?
Shall I?
Sure, yeah. Just final thoughts.
Well, I hope it will become a strategic opportunity rather than it will be treated as a strategic opportunity rather than a missed one. I think there is a degree of optimism there for sure, because I mentioned, I think a couple of minutes ago, that no matter what kind of solution there would be out there in Ukraine, and at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later, the war will end. And I think we all hope that the ending of the war would bring just peace for Ukraine, which is a very complicated matter. But Russia will, regardless of any outcome, Russia will remain a strategic challenge, because unfortunately, there's only, I guess, one scenario in which Russia becomes less of a challenge, which is the full defeat of Russians in Ukraine. Unfortunately, that is unlikely. That seems unlikely right now to foresee. So whether or not there will be a deal or we will see long war, I think Russia will remain a challenge, and in order to cope this threat for the European, from the European perspective, I think it is crucial to use these economic opportunities that Middle Corridor brings and boost strategic interdependency and connectivity, which I think is clear for Europeans right now, that can bring various benefits for the EU in the future. So I do hope, and I have certain degree of optimism that it won't be a missed opportunity.
The Middle Corridor is not a strategic lifeline for the EU. I mean, if it didn't exist, the EU wouldn't suffer any damage at all, quite frankly. It's a strategic lifeline for the countries of the region and will be one of the main factors in supporting regional cooperation and development, no doubt about it, and it will happen, quite honestly. Issues in the short term, Armenian elections, June the 7th. That's the biggest event that takes place in the Greater Caspian region this year. So watch out for that, because that could really destroy, very damage an awful lot of stuff happening in the region. In the medium term, she's writing something down again. In the medium term, it kind of feels to me that the West, the EU, needs to be thinking how to then sort of support that increasing cooperation in the region. I think they need to be thinking about how to work with Turkey better. There's too much. The EU's relationship with Turkey is not good enough, and again, it's driven by one or two countries, or three countries in this case, being problematic in relation with Turkey. They need to use Turkey. He has great access, great knowledge, great experience, and great links in the region. The EU needs to be working with Turkey and through Turkey an awful lot more. The EU needs to then think about, and the UK, not just the EU, but the UK, how do you promote the English language? Language and education cooperation, absolutely key. How do you change the long-term mindsets in these countries, get people thinking West, not just thinking east, looking north, thinking west. Key issue there, so that's a big long-term question for the EU. And then there's the known unknowns. Natia alluded to what will happen to Russia, Ukraine, what's going to happen in Iran, for example. So we just don't know. So we can't predict with any certainty whatsoever.
Well, I want to echo James. That's why I wrote that. Okay, good point. I was going to say the same thing, that I hope Middle Corridor also does not define itself vis-a-vis EU, but more as a regional, cooperation and deep economic interdependence. I think everyone has touched upon everything. It's the curse of being the third speaker and giving your opinions on it. I think what I would wish also in 5 or 10 years' time, we could really, when talking in the policy context, we could also refer to the region as Trans-Caspian region. Right now, it's obviously an emerging concept, but more kind of like a solidified concept as region as a whole, both from the South Caucasus perspective and the Central Asian perspective, which necessitates there being peace, which necessitates is there being, you know, more trade that's going on in the region. Just one point that was not mentioned it will be also for me interesting to see how the environmental aspect really plays out. It's not as much I mean, it's now talked about, but not as much put an emphasis on in terms of like both the global warming, the water issues, the Caspian shrinking, and all of that, which could have really implications for the middle corridor and all of the actual trade routes and how they, how they are manifesting itself. And my last point would be that it's hard for me to guess because I don't know how the EU-China relations would be in 5 to 10 years. They can become the best friends, like friend of a friend, enemy of a friend, whatever is my best friend, or they can still become like it could be driven to a more competition than what we're seeing right now. So that would really change the contextualization of which we're talking about middle corridor. That's what I'll say.
Thank you very much. I think we're quite over time, so we're going to call it there. Please join me in thanking our panelists. If we have time, can we open up to a couple questions from the audience? Anybody?
I have a question. I was waiting.
Yes.
Before taking the question, I just want to make like a little disclaimer that we are recording this event. Obviously, the camera is directed towards the panel, but when you're asking the question, your voice is going to be in the video. If you do not want to be included, just let us know, please.
You didn't ask me that question. I don't want to be included.
Before you came.
So I have like kind of slightly tricky question.
That's one for Ramon.
You talked about strategic sort of plan of European Union,
Not
and
me.
that EU has lack of strategic plan towards this region. Do you think that it's too late for strategic plan when Russia is actually conducting hybrid operations on the EU soil, sending drones to Belgian base which houses nuclear weapons of the US, and blowing up warehouses in Warsaw? There is time to like vision, or the sort of objectives should be what steps should be taken in order to sort of emphasize their influence, because James mentioned that for EU it doesn't matter really. I would disagree with that, because it's about how much influence you can project, and the less influence you project around your territory, less influential and less powerful you are, particularly in this sort of multi-dimensional world order. So yeah, my question would be like, do you think it's time, we have time for strategic visions, or we actually have to find the way what we need to do like today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow?
My point was more related to the middle corridor, the function of the middle corridor, which I don't think is a strategic issue for the European Union as such, because it doesn't need the goods to be transported via the middle corridor. It can use the northern corridor or sea routes. That was my point. The middle corridor is more relevant for the countries of the region rather than the European Union. But your wider question is a very wide question, actually. It sounds fairly global to me. And what is the purpose of the EU, and how is the EU able to cope with a world in which, a very fast-changing world in which we've seen the rise of China in the last 10, 15 years or so. We see what Russia's doing. We've seen the rise of multipolarity and big leaders, and then we just see the havoc that Donald Trump is wreaking across the whole world. And
so that's my question exactly. Like, if you, because Natia mentioned that the EU needs to have like strategic vision for the region.
Well, not just for the region. The EU needs to have a strategic vision, full stop, at the moment, because all of its assumptions about the security of Europe, i.e. being embedded in NATO, have just disappeared, thanks to Donald Trump. So that is a much more existential question than the role of the middle corridor and EU's approach towards Central Asia and the Caucasus, if I'm honest. And it's struggling. It's struggling partly because, as I said, it's 27 member states without a common view of the world, and you see that in terms of sanctions against Russia, which just yesterday, and support for Ukraine, which you're seeing almost in real time, quite frankly, how the EU is ripping itself apart over these questions. And it knows it has to completely reorient its whole security policy and defence policy, and that's what it's wrestling with at the moment. And one of the big issues I've always found, I mean, having worked in the European Union for most of my adult life, when the UK was part of the EU, is how, quite frankly, many other countries in negotiations and anyway just don't take the EU seriously, because the EU is great in soft power, it's great in terms of doing regional frameworks and doing kind of connectivity projects and infrastructure, but when it comes down to tough decisions, then they get ignored. Because they can't come up with a coherent policy, a tough coherent policy. There's always one country that says, "Oh yeah, but not sure about that." So all of the arguments and all of the decisions then get sorted out between the Russians and the Americans, basically, or the Americans and the Chinese, with the EU left on the sidelines. And that's the world in which it now lives, and it really has to adjust to that. It is. I mean, you can see that at the moment. These incredibly difficult debates it's having about defence cooperation, security, defence purchases, and what have you. And whether the UK should be included and to what extent, and should it be Europe or the EU and everything. So it's wrestling with all of these issues. I say it's much bigger than just the Caucasus and Central Asia, if I'm honest. And that's part of the problem. I'm not quite sure whether Nata alluded to that, is actually the EU's attention is being distracted by much bigger issues than this region. So it's very difficult to come up with a strategic plan towards a particular region when the whole future of the European Union and Europe is at stake at the moment. Which is a long-winded way of saying I can't really help you very much.
Yes,
thank you so much for the discussion. I think it was very comprehensive and very informative on the topic. We did discuss a lot of different countries and EU's interest in the middle corridor, but I would like to get more of a UK stance in terms of its perspective of what middle corridor is and possible UK interest in the region, if there are any.
Of course the EU has interest in the region. I mean, quite frankly, I don't think I've complained a lot about the European Union. I would complain similarly about the United Kingdom foreign policy. I don't think they're very strategic. I don't think they do geopolitics, and I don't think they're very good at doing joined-up regional thinking. EU foreign policy tends to be country by country. And that's always been one of my big complaints and criticisms, is actually it hasn't really even taken a Caucasus view, and it certainly hasn't taken a middle corridor view, really, other than it's a good thing. And EU foreign policy is, that sounds like a good thing. Yeah, we support that. Yeah, but what do you mean you support that? What are you going to do about it? And it's problematic in that any country can have a foreign policy, but if you don't back it up with resources, and that may mean aid funding, which of course the UK has gone down from 0.7% of GNI to 0.5% and now 0.3%. So we've cut our aid budget by about sort of whatever that is, about sort of 2/3 or something. And then do you back it up with resources on the ground? Not so much. And do you back it up with ministerial and high-level attention? And the answer, again, is not very much. And that's something the UK is particularly bad at because of the way our parliamentary system works. So it's difficult. So they will say the right things, but whether or not that actually amounts to making a difference on the ground, I would say generally not very much. Having said that, in Georgia we did do an awful lot. Put a lot of money into Georgia, a lot of resources into Georgia to sort of, strangely enough, smooth their path into the European Union. Even though we thought EU wasn't a good idea for us, we think it's a good idea for other countries. So we're quite happy to support them and work with them to help them join NATO and join the European Union. So we put a lot of resource into that, and of course we put a lot of resource into Ukraine as well. But certainly, I will be perfectly honest with you. I know this has been recorded, but however, when I was in the job, 2019 to 2022, the sense of, is there any spare resource to go around? Number one, Ukraine. Number two, Georgia. The rest of the region, yeah, whatever. So that's quite a cynical view of the way the UK approached the region. Let's see. There's a reset going on, as I say. There's a meeting with Central Asian foreign ministers tomorrow. So I think hopefully that will reset things. But it's really important that that's not just, we had a meeting and it was great. You've got to follow it up with stuff. And that's what I'm looking out for from the meeting tomorrow. Is like, so what? Okay, you had a meeting, but so what? What does that mean in tangible terms? Will you stay engaged? What will that engagement mean? And that's always the thing to look at. And it's just difficult for British and even for European politicians to sort of stay engaged with a region where they don't have the history, they don't have the geography, they don't have the personal connections, and that's always going to be problematic.
Any questions for Natia and Arzu?
Yes, please.
Yeah, a question to Natia. You spoke about a lot of different geopolitical actors in the region, but I think Turkey was not something which came up. And to the point that James was also making, that there seems to be this confusion in European Union about how do you deal with the Caucasus, South Caucasus, except Georgia. I wonder if that confusion sort of stems from the role of Turkey being in NATO, but not really being a very strong part of the European Union. And if Europe sort of relies on Turkey to sort of handle the region, and how is that particularly going? Because we see a great friendship between Azerbaijan and Turkey, but in terms of it materializing into something, how is that happening? What's the dynamic with Armenia and Russia as well? It's a historical border.
Thank you for the question. I think that's a great question, and we certainly should not miss the role of Turkey, which is increasing in the region, in the Black Sea security framework in general. And Turkey has always had this competition with Russia when it comes to Black Sea and its aspirations, as much as Turkish-Russian relations have been quite turbulent. There were times when there was a greater cooperation between the two, but there were also pressure points. And I think one of the areas where this competition is most obvious is exactly the immediate region, where Turkey feels more empowered as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine, due to the Montreux Convention, and also due to the fact that Russia, from naval perspective, but also militarily, is much weakened than what it was before the beginning of the war in Ukraine. So in the South Caucasus as well, we see that Turkish interests are on the rise. Turkey has immediate interest in the region. With Georgia, Turkey has had a strategic partnership. We see that consistently throughout many years there has been a great economic cooperation between the two, but also Turkish investments into critical areas such as including also military domain has been quite a visible one. But I think the normalization and the peace process in general gives Turkey wider opportunities to place itself even as a bigger player. And also the question that you posed in terms of these dynamics, which is often characterized as a sort of weird dynamics between the EU and Turkey, to what extent that can have regional implication. I think when it comes to the EU-Turkish relations, it's very important to. EU cannot have sort of. Turkey is part of the regional connectivity middle corridor Black Sea security framework. It's an integral part. So you can't just avoid this topic. It's crucial to have greater cooperation with Turkey when it comes to regional issues. And I think something that has been actually widely discussed in Georgia, which is no longer discussed because the country is basically fully now under this, influenced by the domestic political landscape. But when it came to Georgia's regional sort of posture and aspirations within the Black Sea security framework, Georgia has always seen Turkey as its ally to position itself stronger in this setup. Of course, Azerbaijani-Turkish relations are closer than ever, but I think with the normalization and new opportunities when it comes to Armenia-Turkish relations, this really brings an opportunity for the region to be more open, to be more connected, and this is an opportunity for the EU. So I think this could be one of the positive side of how the EU can engage with Turkey to have a wider sort of posture in the region and to use the existing sort of links and regional relationships that Turkey has with individual countries in the South Caucasus.
And Central Asia as well,
And Central
through
Asia.
the Organisation of Turkic States, amongst other things. But EU policy towards Turkey has been hijacked by Cyprus, Greece and France. And again, it's just crazy because Turkey is such a strategic regional player and the EU should be working with and through Turkey much, much more, but they just can't because, again, you've got several member states which have wrecked EU policy. Sorry.
Can I say a few words on the trade side, particularly when talking to the Turkish people on the ground and asking them how they position themselves in the middle corridor? Because if you look at it, Azerbaijan kind of positions it as like the transit hub in the middle corridor. For Kazakhstan, it's the middle power who's kind of driving the middle corridor. For Turkish people, I think the answer was that they're seeing middle corridor more in the framing of the Turkic unity. So I think that's the phrasing that they're coming in, at least from the middle corridor's conceptualization perspective in Turkey. I think Natia touched upon the great point on the Armenia-Turkey relations as well, and how this will really affect the trade and regional connectivity in that regard. And last point on that is Erdogan, in a couple of months ago in his speech, he touched upon the middle corridor, but also I think currently in Turkey there's a lot of conversations about the new trade route that goes through Iraq. So there's a couple of trade routes that they're having a conversation around, and due to Turkey's geostrategic location, the trade passes through that either way, but it's more like Turkey projecting its like either Turkish identity or whatever in the region of South Caucasus and beyond. Not talking about in military terms, but more talking about the economic terms. And the way also, coming back to the point of Erdogan, the way that he was also phrasing it is that the middle corridor is going to create around 140,000, if I cited correctly from my memory, jobs in Turkey in the logistics sector and so on. So it's kind of framing it in terms of like the economic and business benefits for the Turkish people.
Okay, one last question, if we can make this quick one, and then.
It's not the length. It's not the length of the questions you need to worry about.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I'll be quick. So about the middle corridor, in the short term, do you see any risk of Russia using the middle corridor to try to subvert sanctions? And in the longer term, do you think there's a big possibility that after the Russia-Ukraine war ends, trade reverts to the northern corridor and the middle corridor is abandoned?
I think very shortly, the first question, the answer is yes, because we are still seeing the trends are going. If you're following the narrative around also the crypto sanctions self-convention, you would see that the EU has imposed some sanctions against like some crypto currencies, trading like Garantex and GreenX and A75 and all of that. So there's quite a big kind of backstory around that, particularly in the middle corridor countries. I'm not saying this really necessarily happens in the middle corridor route, but all of the countries that are talked about in the middle corridor, we are seeing the sanctions circumvention happening. In terms of what is going to be the future, I mean, what you're saying is a very potential risk that probably if the war ends, if the normalization happens in when, ifs, and a lot of the stuff, one could see how most of the trade shifting back to the northern corridor. I think at that point what would be really important is at what stage will the middle corridor be. So right now, as I said in my speech, that there are still a lot of bottlenecks. When we're talking about middle corridor, you still have to understand, once again, coming to the practicalities and business point of views, that it really has to be cost efficient and it really has to be time efficient. There are a lot of ifs and ones for the Russia-Ukraine war, so we don't know when it's going to end or how it's going to look after it. And depending on the maturity of middle corridor, the answer might really change whether the trade is going to shift or not. But frankly speaking, if you look at the trade easiness, obviously passing the trade through 2 countries is easier, much easier than passing trade through 5 countries with different bureaucracies, with different systems and all of that. So that will really depend on how what the future was.
Okay. Thanks. Help join me in thanking our panelists. It's been a long night.